In our previous episode, we spoke about the different ways that First Nations cultural and scientific knowledge could benefit space. In today's episode, we will hear about some of the challenges in space and how First Nations knowledge can help us in solving these challenges. Our mob's connection with Sky Country goes back over tens of thousands of years, but our relationship with space has changed. Advances in technology has improved our way of life by providing us with services like GPS, satellite communication, and satellite imaging. As more and more satellites are launched into space, we need to think harder about things like space debris, space sustainability, and looking after our dark night skies. Today we will tell you more about the challenges posed by human presence in space. Welcome to Episode 9, Challenges in Space.
Welcome to Episode 9 of our radio series with the Australian Space Agency. Today, we will be talking about the challenges of space. Space exploration and commercial space activities present significant challenges. As technology has advanced, it has become easier for us to put people and things or objects in space, which means that there are now more private space companies. However, as it becomes easier to go to space, we face different challenges such as how to regulate or make safe these activities, land access, ethical concerns about what we do in space, and the impact of space activities on First Nations people, culture, and country. The Australian Space Agency is responsible for regulating commercial space activities in Australia, which means it is our job to make sure that space activities are done in a safe and responsible way. The increase in the number of private companies in the space sector means that the government's responsibility increases to make sure we have a safe space sector in Australia and to make sure that we meet our obligations to the international community and provide information to ensure the responsible use of space to look after the environment and First Nations cultural heritage. As we spoke about earlier in the series, satellites in space provide us with important services that we use every day, such as satellite communications and GPS on our phones. But as more satellites go up into space, it becomes more crowded. Just like when there are more cars on the road, the traffic is worse. According to recent information available in March 2025, there are over 8,000 active satellites orbiting the Earth right now, as well as thousands of inactive satellites and smaller pieces of debris. With more satellites and rockets being launched than ever before, the amount of space debris is increasing, which also increases the chances of objects colliding in space. This would have a huge impact for us on Earth. Satellites also contribute to light pollution, which block out light and impacts our view of the sky. Our mob were the world's first astronomers, and our knowledge of the stars has been passed down for generations through song, dance, and oral traditions. The question is, how can we keep culture strong, preserve our cultural connection to the sky, and clean up space for the next generations? To address these issues, Australia is participating in international efforts to develop sustainable practices or sustainable ways of doing things in space. Today, we have a special guest from the Australian Space Agency. Dawson is joining us to talk about space sustainability and what the Australian Space Agency is doing in this area. You're tuned into Tiba Radio, your voice in the bush, and today we have a very special guest joining us on the line. We have Joe from the Australian Space Agency. It's great to have you on the show, Joe. How are you?
Very well, thanks, John. Thanks for having me on the show. Pleasure to be here.
That's the way. So tell us a little bit about who you are and your journey to working with the Australian Space Agency.
Yeah, of course. I'm Joe. I work for the Australian Space Agency, and I work in the civil space policy team. So that's basically all policy for space that isn't national security or defence related. And I lead our space sustainability policy work. And I'm looking forward to discussing more about space sustainability shortly. First, a bit about my journey. Since I can remember, I've always been passionate about space. I grew up on Lodgett country in the Perth Hills, Western Australia. I remember going on camping trips or even in the backyard and spending hours looking up at the stars. So eventually I decided to study physics at university, focused on astronomy and space. And then after my bachelor's, I was lucky enough to spend some time working for CSIRO, Australia's National Science Agency, in their astronomy and space science division. And through that experience, I was working on one of their telescopes in Wajara Yamaji country in remote Western Australia. It was a fantastic experience. And then I continued my studies, completing a master's in physics, and then essentially after a couple more experiences, I ended up at the Australian Space Agency where I am today.
Oh, that's an amazing journey. Can you explain to us what space sustainability means and why is it important for our future?
Absolutely. So I think put simply or put in one sentence, and I'll explain this, of course, space sustainability is all about ensuring we can continue to benefit from space and using space now and into the future. So I believe this was spoken about earlier in the series, but space is integral to our everyday lives. In Australia, we use space for phone, internet access, especially in remote areas. We use it for navigation, for GPS. It also helps us with weather forecasts, for example, for the recent cyclone Alfred, and more broadly it helps us fight challenges like climate change. But in the past years, space is being increasingly used. So there's been more rockets and more satellites being launched into space than ever before. In fact, the number of spacecraft in orbit around Earth today is more than 3 times higher than it was just over 8 years ago. And this essentially poses several challenges, which puts our use of space and the benefits that we derive from space at risk. And I'll touch on a couple. One of the first ones is space debris and congestion. So as more rockets, satellites, etc. are launched into space, one of the effects is that there's an increasing amount of debris, which is essentially rubbish being left behind in orbit around the Earth. By debris or rubbish, I'm talking about things like leftover parts of rockets, maybe pieces of spacecraft that have broken off, or even satellites that are dead and no longer work. And this is a challenge because for the satellites that we use and that are still working, they could collide with this debris, which could damage them or, in the worst case, destroy them.
How does the Australian Space Agency contribute to global efforts in maintaining space sustainability?
So maintaining space sustainability is something we do quite a bit at the agency. It's something we're very committed to. I should start by saying no one or no country owns space. It really is a global area, and maintaining space sustainability is a global problem.
Everyone works together.
Yeah, that's right. So there are some organisations, international organisations, that deal with these challenges, like the challenge I just discussed. For example, there's one through the United Nations, and Australia is very much engaged in this organisation, as well as other organisations, international organisations that aim to maintain space sustainability. So that's sort of what we do internationally. We also have a number of initiatives domestically for space sustainability. So one that I've been working on with the team is developing a space sustainability policy. And the idea of this policy is essentially it considers the challenges that we just spoke about, so space debris and others, and then what the role of the agency and the government is in addressing them.
How can First Nations scientific and cultural knowledge improve our approach to space sustainability?
Yes, I'll start by acknowledging that First Nations cultural and scientific knowledge spans over 60,000 years, and First Nations cultures have been observing stars for a long time. And essentially with such rich history, depth, there are many ways that First Nations cultural and scientific knowledge can improve our approach to space sustainability. There's also many similarities between this knowledge and how we approach, or how we can approach, space sustainability. I'll give a couple of examples. So one is a number of the challenges of increasing space activities is this has environmental impacts. So for example, as more rockets are launched, this releases emissions which pollute the atmosphere, and it can also lead to parts of those rockets falling back to Earth and as trash and polluting either the ocean or the land. And essentially, in an approach to space sustainability, we should look at how we can regenerate nature in response to these impacts, which has similarities with First Nations' approach to caring for the country. A second example, more in response to the space debris problem I spoke about earlier, one way to target this problem is to use what we call more of a circular approach to space activities. So to give you an example of what this means designing rockets and satellites that we can use multiple times or even recycle, as opposed to just using them once for a single thing and then them turning into debris. And by doing so, this is more of a circular approach to space activities and how we use space in general. And again, this has similarities with First Nations' approach to caring for the country. So I guess in short, many ways, First Nations cultural and scientific knowledge can improve our approach to space sustainability. And this is definitely part of what makes the topic of space sustainability so exciting, so interesting, and is definitely part of what I love about it.
Alrighty, well thank you very much, Joe, for joining us on the program. It's great to hear your insights and knowledge into the space sector here in Australia. Of course, very exciting to see it growing and more partnerships, like of course talking with myself here on the TIBA network, going out to more than 30 Aboriginal communities right here across the Northern Territory. So yeah, thank you very much for taking your time out of your busy schedule to chat with myself and as well as the listeners about, of course, improving the future here in Australia through space.
No, thank you, John. It's been a pleasure to be on the show. I really appreciate it.
You're tuned into TIBA Radio, your voice in the bush, broadcasting to more than 29 Indigenous communities here in the top end of Australia. And here to tell us what is being done to look after dark and quiet skies is our next guest, Lauren Springer from the Australian Space Agency. Welcome, Lauren. Thank you for joining us. Can you tell us a bit about who you are and your journey towards working with the Australian Space Agency?
Absolutely, and thank you for having me on. So yes, I'm Lauren and I've been working for the Australian Space Agency for just over 2 years now. I have a background in astrophysics, which is all about looking at stars and galaxies. So I'm very interested in all aspects of space science. So that can range from looking for life in the universe to understanding how galaxies work and how humans can work and live in space. And so these are just some of the topics I deal with on a day-to-day basis as the Space Science and Sustainability Officer here at the Space Agency, as well as dark and quiet skies, which I think we'll get into a little bit later on.
Excellent. So what does it mean when people talk about dark and quiet skies?
Yeah, so there's two parts to this. So there's the dark skies and the quiet skies. So I'll start with the dark skies first. So when we look up at the night sky, we can usually see the full scale and majesty of the stars in the Milky Way here in Australia. We're very lucky in the southern hemisphere. In the northern hemisphere, they have a lot of light pollution. So what does this mean? It means that the light from Earth, so the lights that we use in our houses and on the street, can interfere with our view of the night sky, and we find it very difficult to actually see the stars at all. So we have light pollution coming from Earth-based light sources. So I mentioned a few there, from house lights and street lights, but we also have interference coming from lights reflected off satellites in the sky as well. And this can cause big issues for astronomers who are using telescopes and cameras to take images of the night sky, and it can cause damage and interference in their images that they use when they're doing scientific research. So that's the dark skies aspect of it. The quiet skies is a different part, which a lot of people don't think about. If you mention quiet skies, your first thought might be, the sky isn't noisy. What does it actually mean? But for astronomers, we use the whole range of what we call the electromagnetic spectrum, which is basically a tool that we use to look at different stars and galaxies. So these astronomers are using the radio part of the spectrum. So So this part of the spectrum isn't visible to the human eye, but other things can also cause interference when we're looking at the sky through a radio spectrum lens as well, and this comes from satellite interference too. So when satellites are broadcasting messages down to Earth, this can interfere with the instrumentation that we use on Earth as well. So that's a bit of an overview of the dark and the quiet skies.
What measures can be taken to reduce the effects of space activities on dark and quiet skies?
Yeah, so a lot of the astronomy and scientific community are working with some of the big satellite companies to find ways to reduce light pollution. So you may have heard of Starlink as one satellite company, and astronomers are working very closely with Starlink and SpaceX to make sure that those satellites don't interfere with their scientific readings. So some of the ways they're looking at reducing light pollution include painting the satellites a darker color so that they reflect less light, and also angling the satellites away at a certain angle or orientation so that the light, instead of reflecting back down to Earth, reflects back into space so that those interferent patterns don't appear in scientific images. So really, I think the key thing here is to make sure there's communication and open dialogue, but also making sure that all aspects are considered. So it's not just for the scientific integrity as well, and making sure that we can continue to do good science. Yeah, so I think you may have had Joe Dawson on earlier in this series, and I think he may have touched upon the space sustainability policy that we're working on currently at the agency. So a key part of that policy is about ensuring we protect the natural environment, Australia's cultural heritage, and ensure access to space for scientific research as well. So that key theme of the sustainability policy will really drive how we go moving forward as an agency and how we foster dialogue with our community to ensure that we can take some steps to help preserve dark and quiet skies, and really promoting the concept of sustainability in space as a whole, and using our platform and our reach to really educate people about dark and quiet skies.
Alrighty, thank you very much, Lauren, for taking the time out of your day to chat with myself and everybody here on the T-Boot Network, covering more than 29 Aboriginal communities, Indigenous communities here in the top end.
Great, thank you so much for having me.
Today, you've heard many of the challenges facing the space sector, such as regulating space activities, how we manage the increasing number of objects in space, and the impact of space activities on First Nations people. As we wrap up this yarn on the challenges of space, it's clear that maintaining dark and quiet skies is important for both astronomical research and our cultural heritage. The increasing number of satellites and debris in space poses significant challenges, but through international collaboration and sustainable practices, Australia's active participation in these efforts is an example of our commitment to looking after the sky country for future generations. As always, if you want to find out more, visit the Australian Space Agency's website at space.gov.au. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the challenges in space. In next week's final episode, we will explore the future of space.